Hi, and welcome to the Environment TV Forum. I'm Charlie Olson, your host and producer. Our goal is to bring to you, the viewer, our thoughts about today's environmental topics. That's the current, ongoing, and long-term concerns that we see through the eyes of grassroots activists. Today's forum members are Lenny Librizzi. He's the host of the podcast, And Now a Word from Our Environment, and is a retired New York City gardening specialist from the Grow New York City program and worked with community gardeners for 31 years. He managed the Community Gardens Mapping Project, a catalog of open spaces in New York City, and he teaches horticulture and environmental workshops. Mark Latour is an author and former land management expert who worked at the city and county level and is presently on the New York State Open Space Conservation Plan, which is helping to choose where environmental monies, that's in the billions of dollars, will be spent throughout New York State. His recent legislation includes the Drought Reduction Bill, as well as the Reforestation Jobs Bill. And Ken Gale, an author, a host, founder, and producer of Ecologic, a decades-long running weekly radio show broadcast on WBAI at 99.5 FM on your radio dial, which is concerned with the entire comprehensive field of the environment. Ken is also a traveling environmental guest presenter at various civic gatherings and a longtime hardcore birder. Another member of our forum panel is Marilyn Ellie, who at this time is on holiday, but will join us for upcoming broadcasts. Marilyn Ellie is a longtime anti-nuclear advocate at the Indian Point nuclear reactor in New York State, and was one of the 4 people highlighted in the documentary Indian Point, the movie. All of our members have multiple titles and decades of experience in the vast field of the environment. It has been said that love is most important and makes the world go round. But in our eyes, it's the environment that is the most important and makes the world go round. It's in that light that we look at any and all of the topics that we talk about. All things are related to the environment, the entire cosmos, the smallest atomic subparticle. But we can't discuss them all in one sitting, though try we might. We will try to connect the dots throughout our forum. In the last few weeks, mainstream media has been covering quite a lot of environmental news. One of them deals with climate mitigation strategies, and there are quite a bunch of those strategies. And they cut across science, politics, economic, society, individual responsibilities, and even the fantasies of science fiction, just to name a few of the disciplines. Here to begin our discussion on climate mitigation strategies is Lenny Librizzi.
Thank you, Charlie. So maybe I'd like to start with the why. And the why is that scientists have been warning us for many years that the Earth's climate is severely out of balance. The amount of carbon dioxide and other planet-warming gases in the atmosphere are at record levels and rising. The average temperature of the Earth is setting new records each year. Destructive storms, wildfires, and record rainfalls are happening on a regular basis. The ocean's temperature is rising even faster than the air temperatures, and scientists are somewhat baffled as to why. Can we stop or slow these things from happening? There are many things that can be done to lessen the impact of climate change in our lives and for the planet as a whole. Some are individual actions like lowering your carbon footprint by using less energy, recycling, using less plastic, lowering thermostats, etc. There is a great divide in the use of energy and carbon footprint between rich and poor. The rich can lower their footprint more than the poor can, obviously. On a larger scale, there are many techniques, inventions, and some science fiction-like ideas, as you mentioned, Charlie, for climate mitigation. There's a concerted effort to use batteries to power our lives, which comes with some side effects and issues. There are many scientists working to make batteries safer, recyclable, longer lasting, and less polluting. Where that energy comes from has to change. Moving from fossil fuels to low carbon energy like solar, wind, and geothermal has many proponents, and the use of these types of energy is rising exponentially while the efficiency is being improved. Energy efficiency and energy conservation can lessen the need for having to produce more energy. Nuclear energy is also being promoted as a low carbon energy source, but it comes with problems that far outweigh its benefits. And this will be a topic for a future discussion. Capturing carbon has many proponents as well, and a variety of schemes are being developed, like using rock dust, planting trees, as we just talked about, removing carbon from seawater, creating solid carbon-based materials, and storing carbon in old oil wells or in geothermal sites. Preparing the places we live for sea level rise and more severe weather events with seawalls, creating sponge cities, sand motors, and living breakwaters does not lessen the severity of these events, but allows us to weather them. There are several large-scale, unproven techniques like solar shields and cloud seeding that are being proposed. These may be costly and have disastrous side effects. So my question is, do you guys see any of these techniques as being more productive or destructive than others? Would you
Yes.
rule out any of them, and why?
I think number one, there's got to be energy efficiency. That is, burning less methane, which they market as natural gas, in the first place is so important. And I've been told by environmentalists, oh, it's not sexy to save energy. And it's like, wait a minute, saving money is always sexy. I mean, why in the world would you not want to have more money in your pocket because you're spending less money to Con Edison? I don't quite understand that way of thinking. But nuclear energy is not carbon free because one, you need outside energy sources to make a nuclear power plant work. You can't run the pumps, you can't run the safety equipment with the power that the plant generates. It has to be from outside. Usually it's diesel generators on site. And the amount of energy used to keep the nuclear waste cool forever is it takes more energy than the plant created for its entire lifetime. So it's a really crazy solution, and people are so tunnel vision when it comes to that. And geoengineering, I could go on about that. The solar shields and again, a lot of people when they look at solutions are like, global warming is the same thing as climate change. And it's not. It's not the same thing. Deforestation is a part of climate change. Ocean acidification is part of climate change. So to say that it's only global warming and that if you put a giant umbrella over the earth, it's like, well, then how are you going to grow your food if you have a giant umbrella over the earth? That'll cool things down, but you need the sunlight. But they don't want to give up their fossil fuels, and they have enough politicians in their pocket that they'll get all the legislation passed that they want.
Yeah, you can't separate the politics or the economics out of these issues,
Yeah,
because what's happening economically these days is that the venture capitalists are pulling away from things like solar and wind. So that, for a while they were pumping lots of money there, and now all of a sudden they're not. And we don't see that immediately,
yeah.
but it is slightly slowing down what everybody wants. The amount of people using solar, for their own homes is skyrocketing. So
Yeah, it's been the
The- the-
fastest growing occupation for years. And that means there was more solar installers than the year before that, more than any other occupation had more of whatever their occupation was. Solar installers. There's an awful lot of people who know how to do that, and they're making a living off it. It's a wonderful economic boon, and commercial net metering has been wonderful for every state that has it.
The other thing that I get strikes me as funny is that some of the billionaires are looking towards space. They're like, oh, we can, once we ruin this planet, we'll just move to the moon or to Mars, and we can terraform on Mars. And I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson say this, who I respect very highly, and he's like, well, if we can terraform on Mars or the moon, why can't we use those same techniques here on our planet to make our planet more livable?
And
Yeah, the,
only one thing too, let's say we do wind up going to the moon or Mars, we're going to destroy those areas just the way we destroyed the planet Earth. So it's just going to be a part of a vicious cycle. But I agree that the solar geoengineering is really questionable. I cannot believe that the National Academy of Sciences and all these people from all over the world are promoting that. It would undermine the process of photosynthesis. There are so many solutions that are easier and so much more natural, like reforestation. So much uh, that cause so much fewer problems. Likewise, but of course, you're going to have a lot of money available to big engineering companies. You know, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers tends to love these kind of big physical projects, like building dams, for example, that are also harmful. Likewise, even the solution of building a seawall on the coast of some of these lower cities around the world is maybe a solution that's top heavy. There could be a more natural solution again, like planting trees or building further away from the edge of the ocean. That would be superior solutions.
Yeah, one of the things I read recently was about that I never heard of before was something called a sand motor, which is a technique that they've used in the Netherlands. And if we want to look to any place in terms of how to live with the rising sea levels, the Netherlands has been dealing with this for forever. And anyway, it takes a lot of sand, but it creates a way to slow down the wave action and actually build up the sand rather than having the sand erode away in storms.
Where do you get the sand from?
Well, right. I mean, today we are rebuilding sand areas by pumping sand out of the ocean. That happens all the time. It happens in Rockaway Beach. Happens in all the wealthier coastal areas throughout the country. But and that takes a lot of sand. But these sand motors take even more. But it's a natural technique that might be too expensive to do. There may be better ways to go about this, like moving away from the coastlines. Of course, that's not possible. There's some cities around the world that are at sea level, and they have 10 million people living there. Where are all those people going to go?
When they get
So
flooded,
one
where are they going to
example of
go?
that,
Right.
say again, Mark.
what I was going to say, one example of that is in Jakarta, Indonesia, where it's a huge capital city of over 10 million people. It's sinking very, very rapidly. Uh, so partially it's due to um, the soil collapsing from digging so many wells and pulling out the groundwater. So they're building a new capital on another island. But I can imagine how many trillions of dollars, that would cost to do so. So instead, for any new city, you have the chance to plan. build it at a higher elevation or further away from the coast or in a more sound area. But so yeah, that's becoming more common as the sea level is rising.
It was in the news this past week or so, is Los Angeles, where they got like a year's supply of rain in a couple of days. And they were able to withstand that because they've been preparing by creating permeable surfaces throughout the city that can hold some of this water, at least temporarily, when it rains so much, and not cause severe flooding. So that, that's another technique that doesn't necessarily cost a lot. It's just what materials do you use, and where do you place spots that will hold the rainfall, and not cause flooding.
Yeah, I think every builder should be asking themselves, where's the water gonna go?
Mhm.
When it rains, when there's a storm, when there's a flood, where's the water going to go? And if it's going to go in people's homes, then that's not the right way to build. But I realize that the people who are designing these homes and the ones who are building these homes are not going to live there. So I guess it's not in their best interest to ask a question like that. And sometimes people who buy and sell the homes are not even asking those questions. It's bizarre. There's a wonderful story about if you remember the tsunami in the Indian Ocean that came from the direction of Indonesia, and uh, there were these people. They were fishing, and they didn't know there was a tsunami. So when they saw it coming, they got to this cypress forest as fast as they could, and they were in the forest when the tsunami hit, and the channels of the forest absorbed the water. The trees themselves absorbed the energy of the tsunami, and they lived to tell the tale. And not too far away from that, where that forest was a town, and the town got wiped out. A lot of people died because they had no protection from the tsunami. And so if they had left the coastal forest intact throughout all of this was in Thailand, uh, people wouldn't have died. It's that simple. If a fisherman can survive a tsunami in a forest, then anybody can survive a forest by not even being in the middle of it, but being behind the forest. But it's not the way people think. They're going, I want to have a house that looks at the water. And when a tsunami comes, well, I'll just get my insurance.
Well, it's going to
And
be very hard to get people to change their way of life. I know that the three of you, the four of us, change a lot of our lifestyles based on the environment, what we think about things connected with that. But that's one of the problems that we have. We have these shields and going to Mars and the sand, etc. method that you mentioned, but we're not working together on one plan that could possibly differentiate through the different parts of the world, but it would bring society together and say, society, here are the 6,000 choices you have, and this is what the future could be. So I think politics and society's taboos and our way of upbringing prevents us to a high degree from seeing all of this. And part of the solution is education and getting out there. Go ahead.
yeah, it depends on how the education is done. In Pakistan, uh, there are a lot of people who were overfishing, and they suddenly had like almost no fish to catch. And the government said, don't catch every fish that you can, leave some so they can reproduce, and then you'll have more fish for next year. And they're like, the government's trying to tell us what to do. I don't want to listen to the government. So then they went to an imam, and the imam said the same thing, right? Let some of the fish survive so they'll reproduce. Well, they listened to the imam, who said the same thing the guy from the government said. And sure enough, the fish started reproducing. The following year, they had more fish. And their reaction was, see, God provided. We listened to the imam and God provided. And so it really depends on how you educate people. if the government has created a situation where nothing they say is believed, then you got to find somebody who can say things for you.
Well, that's politics, and it's way beyond me.
Yeah,
That's like trying to change the weather, but the answer is there in
we
what
did
you
change
just
the
said.
weather.
Yes, no, well, wanting to change the weather. I think you're totally right. Find a method that society and people there in small groups or larger groups can relate to, that they can trust. But to figure that out, it's beyond me. I'm glad that we have at least one example where it did work.
Well, that city in Thailand, I don't know how they rebuilt it. When the tsunami wiped out that I don't know if it's a city or a town, when the tsunami wiped it out, did they rebuild or did they put the forest back?
It,
There are a lot of places in the world. Africa seems to be a poster child where they put the forest back, and so the people who live behind the forest, they survive. They do fine. So it's a case of, if it takes, it's terrible that it sometimes takes people to die from a natural disaster for people to realize that there are different ways of living, so that they're not going to be the next ones to die.
and my experience says even death doesn't help out or make people
Yeah,
change
it
their
depends on the
minds.
person.
COVID is a great example of that, as well as other kinds of things. Yeah, it depends on the person. So that politics is a big, big answer to that.
Which sort of one of the questions I had when I was researching this is, it seems like you could break down these climate mitigation strategies to the big things that takes a country or a coalition or a
Mhm.
corporation to create. And then there's the everyday things that people can do. And I mean, I think both should be necessary,
Yeah.
but what do you think? Should we try to figure out a way to have the individuals do things, or should we promote some of the battery improvement strategies, or the fixing the grid to help us to be able to have all the electricity that we need?
I
What do you
jump
think?
right, I jump right in there if I can and say all of those things and see what works. Go ahead.
Well, what the United Nations said is we have to do everything.
Mhm.
And I've been noticing articles in, progressive magazines and stuff, where they go, oh, we have to take care of the carbon dioxide, but not the methane. And then someplace
Mhm.
else said we have to take care of the methane from these natural gas pipelines, and we don't have to worry about carbon dioxide. We have to worry about them both. And it wasn't just individual choices that got us into this mess, or that helped, but it was also policy. So policy has to be changed, and individual choices have to be made. It's everything. It's everything that got us into this mess. So everything has to get us out. I hope I live to see it. I probably won't.
I don't think so either. It'd be beyond us. Mark,
Yeah, I
anything you want
also
to
like
add?
to see a focus on natural solutions. So when you talk about some of these, flooding situations where you've got like a big atmospheric rain coming in through California and Oregon, you can put in something like terraces to hold back some of that rainwater, so it's not going to erode all of the river edges down and below it. And that's a natural solution, for example, that the Inca used, many hundreds of years ago, terracing. And even doing small scale solutions like cisterns. But I think some of these really big projects like the solar geoengineering and the seawall, sometimes they can be boondoggles where the money is really thrown away ultimately because it's a solution that doesn't really fit the problem.
Yeah, the whole idea of capturing rain, that was one of the things I did a lot of when I was working. We installed rainwater tanks in community gardens so they could use the rainwater to irrigate the plants rather than using city water. And at the same time, it had a triple bottom line. You were capturing rainfall that you could use. It was stop, you weren't using the municipal water supply, and you were helping to minimize combined sewer overflows. And when we did it initially, the city Department of Environmental Protection was like, oh, that's too small. You know, we need to build a, you know, 1 million-gallon tank, or a billion, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of gallons of tanks underground to store that much water. And over time, they've started to come around to the idea of what's being called distributed infrastructure. Same thing with the electric grid. You know, there are a lot of these microgrids popping up now, which is becoming a solution instead of building the nuclear power plants or the larger fossil fuel burning plants that are out there. So there's a lot to be said for small scale, localized solutions to these problems.
Lenny, you mentioned combined sewer. What's that?
So in New York City and some of the older cities in this country, you have sanitary sewage and you have storm sewage. And sanitary sewage is when you flush your toilet, take a shower, that stuff has to go through into a sewage treatment plant and get processed before the water gets put back into the rivers and streams and the ocean. And then there's the storm sewers, where every time it rains, all that water that comes down has to go somewhere. And New York City has a lot, I can't remember the number now, but a great number of sewage treatment plants distributed around the city, and they're designed to handle the sanitary sewage and a very, very small amount of storm sewage. So that's the combined sewage. The problem is when it rains as little as a tenth of an inch of rain, the sewage treatment plants are over capacity, and they can't just handle part of it. So they dump all of it into the Hudson River, the East River, Jamaica Bay, um, Raritan Bay, the Kilvan Cull. So that's what the combined sewers are. In a year, about 17 billion gallons of untreated waste is dumped into those bodies of water in New York City.
We're just about out of time here, Lenny and forum members. Would you like to sum up what you're talking about? This will be a continuing topic, as all of our topics will be continuing. We'll see what's new in the news at each time.
There's a lot that can happen at the state level, the municipal level, at the federal level. Many states, for example, Florida, they're really just beginning to develop a database of what parts of the state are vulnerable, and what can be done to minimize the adverse impacts of the sea level rise and the storm surge and the saltwater infiltration. So more and more of that needs to happen at a state level. Not all small municipalities may be equipped to do that, but certainly the larger ones should be, and the state should be more involved, and the federal government in helping us to plan for these adverse impacts and do what we can to, minimize the adverse impacts.
So I'm going to repeat my same mantra: energy efficiency. Don't waste energy. You're giving your utility a lot of money because you're wasting what you buy. And so there's so many different ways that you can personally save money. A low flow shower head means you don't use as much hot water in your shower because you're not using as much water. You don't have to pump as much. That's energy also. Caulking is something you can do at home, whether you whether you're renting or owning. You caulk the windows, and you won't lose as much air conditioning in the summer. You won't lose as much heat in the winter, and you will feel the difference right away. And government should be supporting things like that. There are more states that have renewable energy standards than energy efficiency standards. That's the wrong way around. Every state should have energy efficiency standards and help their own citizens to get them. But no utility in any of those states is going to want the government people that they give money to have their people be efficient. So you have to do that on your own. You have to do your own efficiency. You can't wait for the government to help you do it. If you need any help, there are plenty of places to go to, including this show, to learn how to be more efficient.
Go ahead, Lenny.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, one of the things that I brought up was nuclear energy, and I know that's going to be a whole session in the future because there's a lot to be discussed and said about that. But yes, there's a lot of research being done. There's a lot of science going on that hopefully will help to mitigate climate. But there's a combination of using less and fixing what we can, and hopefully slowing down the rise in the amount of carbon in the air, and the rise in the Earth's average temperature, and the storms that are becoming more and more frequent.
There is no pathway to a livable climate without saving our intact forests and regrowing some. The most cost-effective and environmentally beneficial thing we can do is preserve the intact forests. The second most effective thing is to grow forests back. In other words, save the forest to save the planet. Now, Mark is our lead person on this topic. Mark, do you want to say anything further before we go into questions?
Well, sure. Just, there are a lot of people who consider the environment and our forests and wetlands, woodlands to be very important, but there's others who do not see those things as important. They take them for granted. Even in the accounting system that we use for all American corporations, people paying their taxes, whatever, we don't account for the damage we do to the environment, to cutting down forests, cutting down woodlands, and they help us in so many ways, from minimizing um, destruction of the soil, to holding the soil in place, to purifying the air that we breathe, um, to minimizing erosion. I mean, they have hundreds of very important functions. That's where wildlife habitat, that's the center of wildlife habitat, of forests and wetlands, for example. But so we really need to pay more attention to keeping these forests and wetlands, forests intact, and to preserving what we've got and to rebuilding what we've lost.
Mark, do we really have to be concerned about the rainforest and other plant life that is very far from where we live?
We do, in fact. I mean, it's easier to be concerned about the forests and the woodlands that are in our neighborhood or in our town or even in our state. But the deforestation that's going on all over the country, all over the world, affects us. So, for example, deforestation of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil that adversely impacts the climate from Mexico to Texas, all through the Gulf Coast states. And even deforestation as far away as the Congo in Africa can be felt in the Midwestern parts of the United States. So that's based on studies from NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Association. So we really have to look carefully. We have to be global citizens, really. We have to look beyond what's going on in our own neighborhoods.
I would like to elaborate on that. The winds of the earth are created by the uneven heating of the earth by the sun. I think most of us know that dark things absorb more of the sun's energy than light things. We know this from cars in in a parking lot. And if one part of a given land area, there's part of it's dark, part of it's light, then it'll absorb energy unevenly. And when it absorbs the sun energy unevenly, wind starts to be created as the energy moves from one place to another. A forest will absorb more of the sun's energy than something that's deforested. So when you deforest something, you're changing the way the sun is heating the earth itself. And that's going to affect the winds of the earth, which will affect how the weather travels and how the climate is. So it's really important when they start deforesting huge swaths of Brazil or the Congo or Southeast Asia. They're changing the weather patterns of the earth, and those weather patterns are going to affect everyone, not just in the direct path of the wind from Southeast Asia or Africa, but everywhere, because everything travels, everything flows. It's all connected. We're all on one small planet.
So you're saying that the cutting down of these forests or the jungles changes the weather, which seems to be in one place in the Amazon, and that travels and affects what's happening in Canada over time.
Yeah, yeah.
Marks, that's what you found out? Go
Sure,
ahead.
just mentioning Canada. I mean, we've got the huge boreal forest going all the way across Canada from the Yukon all the way eastward to Labrador. 99% of the cutting there is clear cutting. So you can imagine how the temperature, the rain, the aridity would be affected by such a big action. And the fact that people are cutting down these forests without really thinking about the environmental impact is serious, but we're hoping to, share the message with people that that is a problem. And so climate change, climate, rains, wind, heat are all related to our forests and our woodlands.
And what about the topic of biodiversity? Is that something that you're thinking of?
It's absolutely essential. I mean, again, that's something many of us are, it's very, very important to many of us, but other people don't see it that clearly. I would think that people living in cities, for example, probably don't have much experience with wildlife diversity. Um, but if there's no habitat, then there's no species. So we have more and more endangered and threatened species every year because we are losing their habitats. So the forests are being cut down, and the wetlands are being drained or polluted. The rivers are being polluted. In the ocean, we're dumping our waste, from medical waste to household waste, and that's undermining diversity of ocean species. Uh, so it's absolutely essential to preserve these forests just for that reason alone, not even related to any human impact.
When you mentioned cities, I read something recently, not just preserving forests, but planting trees seems to have more value planting them closer to cities because the trees will absorb carbon dioxide and other pollutants and help to clear the air where people live. In fact, as the amount of carbon in the environment is increasing, we found that trees and other plants that grow in urban environments grow faster and larger because of the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. So there's a lot to be said for trees, both on large scale, as you're talking about, Mark, but also close to the city as well.
Absolutely. And there's other impacts too. For example, the trees and these little woodlands, they lower the temperature of the neighborhoods around them. I can tell you
Exactly.
firsthand where I am. I've got a little woodland. It's just 2/3 of an acre on one side of my house. That side of the house is 10 degrees cooler than the other side in the summer. So when you plant these trees or save the ones that are there, you prevent the creation or expansion of an urban heat island. So the whole neighborhood becomes cooler with this urban reforestation and suburban reforestation.
Can you talk a little bit about
Urban heat islands?
heat islands? That's the word. Yes.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. You've got these downtowns. It's well known that downtowns with the big buildings, with the paved streets, with very little in terms of parks or trees, they are hotter than the areas around them, just a mile or two away. And so it's very serious. It's quite common in the economically disadvantaged neighborhoods of all of these big cities where they have fewer parks and fewer trees. Uh, in addition, the trees help to prevent respiratory diseases. So you'll find in these inner city neighborhoods, people even growing up in downtowns, they have much higher rates of asthma than kids growing up in the countryside. And so if you keep planting trees in the urban area, or if you begin more replanting of these trees, you can improve the health consequences for the people living around them, and especially for children growing up, as they will feel the effects later on in their lives.
In some of the books that I've read, Utopia from 1500, that was 1527, 1518, that area, they talk about building the cities in a different way so that there are, like Manhattan has, numerous parks or a central park and then buildings around there. And we don't see that really throughout the city or other areas of the urban development. And that is considered a good thing to do. And what would be the reasons for doing that? And could it really be done?
Well, it can certainly be done for newer municipal developments, and it is being done. But there's a lot of pressure from developers to, build in some of these downtown areas, these urban areas. And so it's always going to be a trade-off. Are you going to have more development, or you're going to have more open space and woodlands? There is a concept that's been out there for a number of decades called smart growth, and that talks about increasing the density of urban settlements around the transportation corridors, for example, so that people don't need cars everywhere. You don't have the single-family homes necessarily, but that would allow you much more green space in the exterior of these uh, downtowns and uh, tightly packed neighborhoods.
So keeping the forest and replanting, we didn't talk much about replanting, but I guess we assume that they're going to be replanting these forests. These trees affect the weather, they affect the climate, they affect biodiversity, they affect the heat in the cities, uh, and they affect the diseases that people have. More trees will help out. It, Writings in the New York Times recently said uh, something about that just planting trees by itself is not an answer. It's a simplistic answer. Uh, can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just a one part of the puzzle. There's going to be a lot of puzzle parts for this solution. But trees are important in so many different ecosystems and areas of development. So if you look at the Atlantic shoreline or even the California shoreline, look at the Atlantic, say up the coast of Florida or the Carolinas, you've got a very, very low elevation. So it's trees and vegetation that are going to hold in the shoreline together that can help to prevent the excesses of sea level rise and deterioration of the shoreline. So people, so now what's starting to happen is there's something called let's see, climate gentrification. So people are beginning to move from these coastal areas where they're under pressure from saltwater infiltration, sea level rise, uh, more and more hurricanes, to places that are 10, 20, 50 feet higher in elevation. That's very hard to do along the coastal plain of the Atlantic, even places like Staten Island and Long Island, Rhode Island. It's an issue with the flooding. So here on Staten Island, we've developed a Blue Belt program to help to vegetate the estuaries and the rivers that flow into the ocean at very low elevations. And that can help to keep these areas of soil and land intact and less vulnerable to upcoming storms and sea level rise.
Why should we care about bears and cougars?
I don't really know. I mean, I just always have, but I think that I consider them to be beings. In other words, I think I consider them to be part of our family, our extended family. And if we only see ourselves as our family, then we're not going to be interested in protecting any other parts of the earth or any other wildlife. But if we see them as extended family members, I mean, to me, then it's valuable to preserve them and to help them to multiply even. But yeah, they provide all sorts of ecosystem benefits to us, even in terms of regeneration of many plants, for example, on the prairies, where the buffaloes tended to the soil, they uprooted the soil and allowed more plants and vegetation to grow. So they have many positive impacts for us. The forests do.
Yeah, and any ecosystem or habitat, all the different creatures that are part of that play a role. You mentioned bears, so bears will like scratch at trees to get at insects that are there, and once they scratch at those trees, eventually fungi will grow out of there. And then other species will come and feed on those things. And eventually that tree will fall down and become habitat for other species. So the simple act of a bear scratching a tree, that has a whole bunch of effects that come after that. If you take the bear away, none of that other stuff happens. So, they're all God's creatures are important.
Well, Mark, you sound very Native American when you talk about all the animals are our family. If you hear that from nearly every Native American nation in North America.
Yeah.
And that's a very big difference between European culture and the Native American culture of anywhere that I'm aware of, whether it's Australia, the Amazon, etc., is we're thinking of development, we're thinking of reclamation, we're thinking of extraction. So we are the masters, the European culture people, and the people who think like that, doesn't have to be a European, could be Japanese, Chinese, or Indian, or whatever, India from India. We think we're the owners of it, and we can do what we want with it. And in the middle ground there is the people who want to recreate in the area of forests and wetlands and woodlands. We want to make use of it with our 4x4s and our skis and all the rest of that as we destroy it. How do we actually balance that? Or should we balance it?
There are a lot of different stakeholders, but definitely there's going to be some sort of a balance. But the balance has to be toward helping the forest and these other important ecosystems like wetlands survive, or it will be our own undoing, really. It's very important to look at the public interest and not just our own self-interest. And so we are in a resource extraction economy, whether it's mining or logging or agriculture or ranching. And those things all have adverse impacts upon the forest and the other ecosystems. But we can't let that go too far without undermining ourselves.
Every day is Earth Day. I'm Ken Gale.
I'm Sally Gellert.
And I'm Donna Stein.
Every week we bring you environmental experts and activists, plus news, in-depth information, and solutions to environmental problems.
Join us at our new time, Wednesdays at 10 a.m. right here on WBAI New York, 99.5 FM and WBAI.org.
Wednesday mornings, 10 a.m. When your air or water are clean, thank an environmentalist. If not, become one. Enough said.
Put up a parking lot.
Well, you've written some of this legislation, and I know I've talked to you about this legislation across America and outside of America too. How in the world do we really get that across to people? Like for instance, this idea of reforestation and planting trees. The New York Times article that I read went into the problems with that because people were planting one type of tree or one that didn't fit to that area, geographic area. And so this person who put millions of dollars into this as a philanthropist found 10 years later that he was very annoyed, dissatisfied that the trees were dead. It didn't do the job it's supposed to do. That's something to think about when you are reforesting the area, I assume. Is
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the last thing we need is more tree plantations, other than that are set up to be cut down again in 30 or 40 years. The more diverse the forest is, the more diverse the wildlife can be. So we want many, many different species of trees and plants and vegetation. And we want many different ages of trees and plants and vegetation. And it's some of the older trees, the treasure trees, the old growth forests where the trees are 100, 200, 500 years old that are especially important in that picture. And we really want to preserve those. Um, in fact, those are the ones that are less vulnerable generally to fires. So it's the younger trees, especially of a single species, that are more vulnerable to these forest fires.
Columbia University years ago did a great study on the difference between biodiversity and single species, where they divided this big old meadow into 100 segments, 10 by 10, because a real ecosystem is complex and it's very hard to study. So they simplified it. And then they would measure the carbon dioxide, the oxygen, they measured all kinds of things, and they found out that biodiversity was more important than biomass when it came to giving us oxygen and taking up carbon dioxide. And they felt that a lot of that was due to the diversity of underneath the soil of microbes and invertebrates, because all these microbes under the soil make trees more efficient. And when you have more different kinds, they make the tree even more efficient. And so, it's and Finland had a problem. They thought, we're our people are having shorter lifespans and we're not healthy, and it's because we've cut down all our trees. So they replanted trees, and they weren't getting the health benefits they expected because it was the forestry industry that was recommending how to put these trees up. And they were like, oh yeah, one species so that we can cut it down later. And it was when they realized that you had to put back a forest, not a tree plantation, that they got all of the health benefits that they wanted, and the longevity increased, and really the whole world should learn from Finland.
Yeah. Not only that, but if you're only planting one species of tree, let's say the trees get some sort of a disease, it can wipe out that entire tree population. Whereas a broader, more diverse forest has much greater ability to, fend off something like that. Oh, I was just looking at remembering Chief Seattle and a couple of quotes from him. One is, "The earth does not belong to us; we belong to the earth." And in terms of the importance of forests. And another one, let me see here. I'll pass on the other one till later, but something about man does not weave the web of life. We are merely a small component within that web of life.
John Trudell, a Lakota elder, said that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors; we borrow it from our descendants.
I remember the exact saying, but a man who plants a tree that he'll never sit under the shade of is thinking about the future.
Yeah, yeah.
They all sound wonderful, and in a world that's reaching overpopulation, though some said it was overpopulated back in the 1970s, and that we were going to run out of oil in the 1970s, and we haven't run out of it. We found newer ways to it. We are really destroying a lot of our nature, our forests, sticking with the topic being forests, wetlands, and woodlands, we can see that it's a continuing battle between those who want to develop and extract or do recreation there with their 4x4s and ruin the soil, that we are destroying a good part of it. And somehow us and at the Environment TV Forum are the people who are going to talk about this more and more. And facts, scientific facts, can be the biggest help here to describe more of what kind of trees last and what experiments show when a tree doesn't, when one kind of tree doesn't work, then we try something else. Just because it failed once doesn't mean that it will fail again. We should try something else. And why should we try it? Because we do need that biodiversity, because we do need to control the climate. There's something to try and control and mitigate it, which I think Lenny's going to talk about very shortly. And we should be doing this to help everybody on the planet. So we will get back to this because this is continuing as it is. If you, some of us receive different newspapers and read the newspapers more, we see that from 10 years ago, there are now articles and news coverage on television and other media on the climate, on the environment, on ecology, on all of this. Well, before you might find it once a month being mentioned in a back page. Now it's nearly every single day. So we're getting some awareness, and it's not just a fad, it's a 10-year fad. And hopefully it grows more and more people pay attention to this. And we will follow it as it happens. So let's look at more of the articles and writings from the UN all the way down to the New York Post and see what they have to say about this.
I would like to ask Mark what he would like our viewers to do.
I definitely like the viewers to be more involved in learning about and understanding the importance of the environment around us, the forests and the woodlands, and get them to begin working toward preservation of the forests and woodlands by talking to their city council members, their state senators and state assembly members. And, you know, anybody at any level can be helped to move the ball forward in terms of preservation of forests and woodlands. Whether you're a city council member, whether you're a citizen, whether you're a Native American tribe, whether you're coming from some other position, whether you're on the corporate side of things. Many leaders of corporations know that it's very important to preserve the environment. So I would ask people to become more involved, maybe spend more time in the environment, and advocate for preservation of for trees, forests, and woodlands.
Lenny, you were a beekeeper. When do the bees wake up from the winter?
That's a good question, Ken. That depends on whether you're talking about honeybees or native bees. The honeybees have not been sleeping all winter. They've been eating their stores of honey, and the female worker bees have been shivering in a ball to try to keep the queen warm and alive. They begin to emerge from the hive for orientation flights and to forage once the temperature goes over 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's late winter or early spring. That's also when the queen begins laying eggs, and the workers begin brood rearing. So that'll be the next generation of the bees. The overwintering bees are all female, by the way. The first males will emerge in spring, 24 days after the drone cells are started. Now, if you're talking about native bees, there are around 4,000 native bee species in North America. The ground nesting species like the bumblebee spend their winters in what's called diapause or hibernation. They emerge or wake up, as the question you are asking is, in springtime, hopefully at the same time as the flowers that they evolved with also emerge. They pollinate the flowers and forage the pollen and nectar they need to survive and raise their young.
What did you mean by hopefully?
Well, with the climate chaos sometimes the flowers might open up before the bee emerges, or vice versa. And then each one of those things doesn't have what they need to survive. They should emerge at the same time, especially for bees that are specific to a plant. Like the one I mentioned, bumblebees, they're generalists. They'll forage on anything. There are certain species that require a certain plant in order to survive. And those are the ones that potentially could be in danger of not surviving if their flowers don't emerge at the same time.
So if the bee is not around for the flower doesn't get its pollen fertilized. And if the flower is not around, the bee has nothing to eat.
Right. It's
So
what comes
they
first,
need
the
each
bee or
other.
the flower.
And yeah, I was thinking of a bee I learned about recently, the squash bee, where it's evolved certain kinds of things in order to pollinate squash.
Everybody says, oh, we need the honeybees so much in order to pollinate so much of the food that we eat. But actually, some of the native species, and again, the honeybee fits into this category, have learned how to do something called sonication, where not only do they pollinate the flowers, but when they're in the flower, they sonicate or vibrate their bodies, and that shakes loose the pollen, and that's what makes the flower get pollinated. And the some of the native bees are much better at that, or the honeybees don't do that, so they're much better at pollinating than the honeybees are.
Can you see this? If you look at a bee you've never seen before go into a flower, can you see them vibrate?
With the naked eye, you have to be very observant.
Yeah.
If you have a chance to somehow look at it with a little scope, you probably would be able to see this. Yes.
So honeybees don't sleep, native bees do, and we need them all.
Yeah. Yes. That's a good sum up of what we just talked about.
Well, thanks, Lenny. It's
Thank
nice to
you.
have a beekeeper you can ask these questions to.
That's right. The beeline
Beeline.
instead of the hotline.
Right.
Now let's try and find out from Mark Latour, who is a person who watches the New York State environmental laws, as well as across the country, he watches these things, and find out what's going on with New York State and environmental laws. Go ahead.
Sure, there's the state legislature, the state Senate, the state assembly have been very, very busy in terms of introducing these legislative bills.
And these are
And
more than before. This is more
I would
than
say
before.
much more than before. That's right. Yeah, and New York is fairly progressive compared to many other states. So when you look for what's on the forefront of environmental legislation in the United States, you look at states like New York, California, Massachusetts, for example. So one of the ones that I really love is an act creating a senior environmental corps that would establish the corps within the Department of Environmental Conservation, also known as the DEC. And it establishes a mechanism for seniors to volunteer their services for environmental purposes. So it doesn't mean they need to be working 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 every day of the year. It could be a summer thing, could be planting trees and vegetation just in the spring or just in the autumn. It could be, so many, many different areas in which they can volunteer, many different parts of the state. Could be urban tree planting, for example, could be removing invasive species, for example. So that's a program that could be very helpful to a lot of people. It's really a win-win, having more people doing environmental work without real cost to the state or to the citizens. The next one that I wanted to mention is a bill establishing wildlife corridor action plan. A bill would identify and protect species that are at risk from habitat fragmentation or barriers to movement, and reduce collision between wildlife and vehicles. So it authorizes the designation and protection of wildlife corridors. So it's incredibly important. Wildlife species they're facing an existential crisis on so many levels, but one of them is their territories, their habitat is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller as development moves further into their territories. And as deforestation takes place, as the wetlands are filled in, as the rivers they drink from are polluted, and so on.
You were
So,
telling me something about Montana. You had an example of Montana?
In Montana, for example, one of the largest landowners in the state, he has tens of thousands of acres. And was hoping to actually fence in that entire area.
Wow.
So that's, I mean, there's got to be a way for wildlife to make it through the area. You can say, oh, well, you know, these species can climb over the fence or they can get around the fence. Well, not necessarily. If you look, for example, at pronghorn, also known as the American antelope, they're very fast runners, but they don't jump. They're not physically able to jump, so they cannot get over a fence. And certainly I understand they want to keep the wolves out, for example, they might want to keep the cougars out, but there's 100 times more species that need to be getting through. Another example would be species like the cougars of California that need to leave their areas for migration purposes, for mating purposes, for food and water, and yet they're hemmed in on all sides by freeways. So in some cases, there are overpasses being built specifically for
Wow.
wildlife to cross over highways.
Unbelievable.
That's actually been a part of federal legislation that's been budgeted. And also these underpasses under highways. If you expand them, make them a little bit bigger, it makes it a passage corridor basically for some of these small and medium-sized animals.
All right. Do you have another one you want to mention? And
Sure, another one that I want to mention that's important to a lot of people, becoming more and more important, is it's called the Birds and the Bees Protection Act, and it prohibits the sale of certain pesticides or the use of seeds coated with those pesticides.
This is a Rachel
throughout the-
Carson kind of piece of legislation.
Exactly, yeah. And those pesticides are so harmful to so many species, so many different types of birds and so many
This
different
is
types
long
of bees.
overdue. Rachel Carson was writing this in the 60s, in the 1960s. Why is it
Very
taking
much
so
so.
long? But keep going.
Yeah. So, you know, even things like the butterflies, for example, and other insects are badly harmed by these pesticides. You know, it's been a big issue with Monsanto's Roundup, for example. They've won some suits, they've lost some suits. So the law is actually not clear in most places about when and where you can apply it. But it's been banned in some countries. It's still allowed in other countries and states. So in New York State, it would be great if we could get as many of these pesticides and insecticides on that list as possible, because birds and bees and other pollinators, butterflies are so essential to our ecosystem.
All right. Well, thank you. I know there's a lot more on the list that you sent me. I'm just amazed. I'm happy that there's so many out there, but we'll try and catch up on our next session. Thanks a whole bunch there.
Well, thank you, Charlie.